We're working on it. With that, I want to introduce Dr. Matt Kerbel from Villanova University. And Matt is going to talk to us about social media and electoral politics, something he's well versed in. He's written numerous books about the connections between electoral politics and the internet, TV news. As you heard this morning too, he's done a lot of work on political parties, including a book he co-authored with John White, who you heard from earlier this morning. And with that, I give you Dr. Matt Kerbel.
Thank you very much, Gene. And thank you to everybody who's here today. I'm going to follow Zoom best practices, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. You can reach a point of cognitive fatigue very quickly when you're listening to one person talk all the time. So I'm going to break my talk into 3 15-minute segments, about 10 to 15 minutes each. In the first segment, I'm going to talk about new media technologies and political transformations. In the second segment, I'm going to talk about the rise of internet politics. And then in the third segment, I'm going to talk about the influence of social media in American politics. And then in between each segment, we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. So again, I thank you for being here. And I'm going to begin by talking about new media technologies and political transformation. The few points that I'd like you to take away from this, if I could, are number one, throughout American history, we've seen transformational political eras dovetail with the emergence of transformations in the media communications. So if we look back and think about the different party systems that we've had throughout American history, and we think about the individuals who have emerged as the leaders of those party systems, we can also look at the emergence of new media technology at those times and the way those individuals used the technology. And we find that the two are related. In particular, and I won't go into too much detail on most of these, but just to give you an idea of what I'm thinking, Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian Revolution and mass-based politics coincided with his understanding of how to use inexpensive printing to support a mass political movement. Abraham Lincoln and the Lincoln Republican Revolution of 1860 coincided with Lincoln's understanding of how to use the telegraph as the first real mass medium. Then we have Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, and radio. We have television, which a lot of people would say is associated probably with John Kennedy, but in a minute I'm going to make the case that actually it's Richard Nixon who unlocked the political ability of television. And then later on, we will talk about the internet and Barack Obama. And then in the third segment, we'll talk about social media and Donald Trump. So the first point I would invite you to take away from this is that this association between transformational political periods and the emergence of new media technologies. The second point I would ask you to take away is that the simple availability of new media is not sufficient to generate political transformation. In fact, we see time and again, technologies exist and are available to be used by other political figures who haven't yet figured out how to use them to their full potential. It's only when somebody figures out the political ability of a new medium does that new medium become politically viable and potentially politically explosive. And then the third point I would ask you to take away is that any new technology simply takes time to emerge. That, and we see this over and over again. Radio existed for easily more than a decade as a viable commercial medium before it became a viable political medium. Television existed for longer than a decade before it really became a viable political medium. And the internet existed for a very long time before we started to see it put to use effectively in politics. So these things don't come along right away. They take a long time to emerge. And for those of us who study the new media, we always have to keep in mind that we're looking at something that that is new, that's developing, and it's quite possible that we may not understand it in real time, that sometimes it takes a little bit of distance to be able to understand it. I think that's the case for internet politics, which we can now appreciate maybe 15, 20 years on. We can look back at the early days of internet politics and understand what worked and what didn't and why. I think it's much less the case for social media because that's only been with us for a few years. And so we just don't have a lot of information to go on. So I did promise to talk about each of these four periods of political change, political realignment, and the association between those eras and the new technology. So the Jacksonian Revolution was the most low-tech of all of these. But what Jackson understood was how you could use printing technology to advance a political agenda. And later on, I'm going to come back to this and talk a little bit about the parallels between the dilemma that Jackson faced and the dilemma that progressives faced 10, 15 years ago in terms of being outsiders to the political process and turning to a new medium of communication to try to put together a mass movement. And that's essentially what Jackson did. He put together a mass movement utilizing a network of newspapers. And back if you look back into Jackson's day in the late 1820s, early 1830s, we didn't have the kind of commercial press that we're used to thinking of today. We had a partisan political press. And in fact, there was a very strong patronage relationship between the political parties and printers or publishers, where if you won political office, the publishers, the editors who supported you would be rewarded with government printing contracts. So printing mattered a lot. It was the way that candidates in this rudimentary party system were able to get their message out. And Jackson, who was an outsider to that system, had access to this, just like anybody else did, but he didn't have access to the patronage. He didn't have access to the insider editorial content that his opponents did. But what he was able to do was purchase a string of newspapers throughout the country and coordinate them. And that's what he did differently. It was this idea of coordination. Printing technology had been around obviously for a very long time. The costs of printing were already going down by the late 1820s, and Jackson was able to take advantage of this. But it wasn't really a new thing. The new thing that he did was to coordinate the editorial content of newspapers, to take advantage of the fact that newspapers could travel through the mail for free, and to create kind of a decentralized network of editors who served as regional campaign managers, could share ideas and help coordinate message, and to do a lot of the things that we see in contemporary political campaigns, but in a rudimentary way. Mobilize voters, get people excited about the campaign, messaging, as I said a minute ago. These are all things that Jackson was able to do through this network of newspaper sites. So the technology wasn't new, the use of the technology was new, and it served Jackson's purpose of putting together a mass political movement. And he was able to do that quite successfully. So this was the technological edge that he had in order to be able to create this movement. Again, of the four examples we're going to talk about in this segment, it's the most low-tech, but it does follow some of the same considerations that we saw today, we're seeing today, or we've seen over the last decade or so, that apply to internet politics, also emerging in its time as a new medium. If we turn to 1860 and we look at what Abraham Lincoln did, largely as president, the way he was able to utilize the telegraph as a new medium that would allow him to do what today we would call centralized messaging. Lincoln was probably the first president to engage in message control, something that in the television era we think of as being secondhand, and we think of being a relatively recent phenomenon. But it actually goes back to Lincoln. Now, the telegraph doesn't. The telegraph predates Lincoln by almost 2 decades. But most people didn't really recognize the political value of the telegraph the way Lincoln did. Lincoln understood that with the rise of the telegraph, you also had the emergence of news services. The Harbor News Service was the first one. It soon became the Associated Press. And that became the first source of national news, and actually was important in the transition away from the party press to a more commercial press and ultimately an objective press. Now, other politicians and political figures understood that you could still get the kind of messaging that you wanted by maybe offering, I guess what we call a favor or a bribe to reporters to get them to report something a particular way. But what Lincoln understood was that as president, he could actually have a monopoly over information by the way he dealt with the wire service reporters, by who he granted access to or denied access to, utilizing exclusives, things that now seem really commonplace. These were new inventions. What Lincoln understood was that this technology, which had been around for a long time, afforded him the opportunity to dominate the messaging that people saw in the Union during the Civil War. And by controlling that message, he was able to make himself the dominant figure of communication at a time when the idea of a strong president or a strong presidency was really something of an anomaly. There had been very few examples of what today we would call strong presidents. And Lincoln was able to utilize this technology in order to make it happen. Fast forward now to the 1920s. And we see the emergence of radio. Again, it took a while for radio to emerge as a medium in its own right. People couldn't figure out how to make a profit on the radio, just like decades later, for a long time, people couldn't figure out how to make a profit on the internet. Anybody who was around in the 1990s remembers people saying, well, the internet is interesting, but no one's ever figured out how to make a penny off of the internet. Well, no one had figured out how to make a penny off of radio. And the problem was, people wouldn't buy radios because they were very expensive to produce, and they were going to be expensive to produce as long as people wouldn't buy them. But people wouldn't buy them because there was very little content, very little programming. That problem was solved in the very early 1920s. And during the 1920s, you start to see an explosion of growth in the sale of radio sets. Prices come down. The medium begins to penetrate the country. But you still don't see political figures understand how best to put it to work. In fact, we associate FDR with radio, but the first president to use radio was Warren Harding. And he wasn't around very long, but when he used radio, he basically used it as a forum for giving speeches. And the same thing applied to Calvin Coolidge, who it actually surprised me to learn was quite good on the radio. And his reputation is that he never said anything, but actually he was quite a good radio figure. Apparently he had a very good radio voice. He enjoyed radio, but he didn't use radio any differently than Harding did, because he was, like other people of his day, he regarded radio as sort of telegraph with voices. And that's really all it was. It's just like the old technology. We're going to use it the way we would do anything else. Hoover didn't like radio. He did use it a lot. He actually made as many radio appearances in his 4 years as FDR did in his first 4 years. But he wasn't particularly good at radio. It didn't like him. He didn't like it. FDR came along and figured it out. And he actually started figuring it out when he was governor of New York. And he understood that the political power of radio is that it allows you to create a sense of manufactured intimacy, which can mobilize people if you do it right. And I won't go into the details because we have such a limited amount of time, but FDR did a lot of work to make that intimacy seem real. He practiced giving his talks. He would speak to a blank wall, and he would practice his inflection. He was coached on how to communicate intimacy. The wording he used when he spoke, when he gave radio addresses, was always the language of inclusion. My friends. He would speak to people who had never heard a president address them in familiar terms, in a familiar way. And he also understood not to overexpose. People think of the fireside chat. That was not a common occurrence. He chose his moments when he was going to do it. He chose the time of day. Now we would call it prime time. He chose it to maximize the audience. There was a lot of work, advance work done by affiliates in his administration before he went on the air. So there was an awful lot of work done to create this sense of manufactured intimacy. And it worked. People responded to it. It was a different use of the medium. And once that was unlocked, once people understood that that's how radio works, anybody who had the facility, had the skills, would be able to use it. And it did help usher in the New Deal era. It's difficult to imagine the New Deal era and then the American experience in World War II without Roosevelt on the radio, utilizing the radio in a way that his predecessors had not. And then finally, television, same story. Television takes a while to become widely utilized for the same reasons that radio took a long time. By the 1950s, people are starting to purchase television sets. The price is coming down. Television existed as a mass medium immediately after World War II in the late 1940s, but it was not highly regarded as a political vehicle by prominent political figures of the day. Truman hated it, really didn't like to use it, didn't want to use it, didn't think it would ever amount to much. Adlai Stevenson, the most prominent Democrat in the 1950s, didn't like it. He did utilize it in his campaigns, but when he did, he utilized it like radio with pictures. So he would try to, during his presidential campaigns, he ran these kind of weekly soap opera events, 30-minute events that were really not very effective because they tried to emulate radio serials, and they didn't work because that's not the way television operates. Television is a different medium. Now, Dwight Eisenhower was the first person to stage a successful campaign utilizing television, and he had the help of some very skilled advertising agents who understood how to market yourself on television. John Kennedy, we would probably think of as the first telegenic candidate, the first candidate who was born to be on television. And I think these observations are true. But where Eisenhower may have been the first president to utilize television, and Kennedy may have been the first president to have been born for the medium, oddly enough, it was Richard Nixon who untapped the political potential of the medium. Because what television allows you to do in a way that radio doesn't is market an illusion, market an image. And in 1960, we saw what television did to Richard Nixon when he was unprepared for the debate against John Kennedy. And he was very aware of that as well. When he ran for president again in 68, he brought on people who understood the medium, and he basically handed the campaign over to them and said, do what you can do. I don't want this medium to take advantage of me. I want to take advantage of it. And he created the illusion of the new Nixon, which was basically the way he was able to reintroduce himself to the public and get people to look at him in a different way. And to do that required a highly controlled media campaign where there was one event a day. There were carefully produced vehicles, advertising vehicles that ran as extended 30 or 60-minute slots in select markets around the country with actors who were really not introduced as actors. They were introduced as ordinary citizens, but they were actors. And it was a stage play, basically, where Nixon would interact with them, and that over the course of 30 minutes, their body language would change. They would lean in, they would nod, that they would be won over by Nixon. And it was an extraordinarily effective and very slick campaign designed to communicate the message that the old Nixon is gone, the new Nixon is more accessible, more willing to listen to people, just a different person completely. And it worked. It worked on television. Now, the irony, of course, is the real Nixon and the real Nixon campaign was none of the things that the image communicated. It was a highly controlled campaign. It was a very carefully scripted campaign. So the new open, accessible Nixon was made possible by this script. But it was also made possible by understanding the way television operates, the way television works. And after Nixon's campaign in 1968, we had a long period of time where you simply could not consider being elected president if you did not at least try to engage television. Certainly the presidents of that era, obviously Ronald Reagan, who came in with acting skills, subsequently Bill Clinton, people who understood the medium, understood how to use the medium, were favored in our politics during the television era. But it was Richard Nixon who really figured out how to unlock that political potential. So I'm going to stop here, as promised, and take some questions before we move on to the next segment.
All right. If you have questions, please submit them through the chat, and we'll get them on to Matt here. But in the meantime, I'm just trying to think here. I couldn't help but think, Matt, and feel free to riff on this however you feel. I think, people come and expect someone who's going to talk about social media to have all these bells and whistles. And what you actually just reminded me of is someone you probably know well and probably read plenty of, Neil Postman, who, probably wrote one of the best books on television and used to stun his students because his computer would typically be off in his office. And he would teach by Socratic method, and he would, these sorts of things. But hold on here, it looks like we have a question. Okay, here we go. How or when did the introduction to cable news alter presidential politics?
That's a great question. And the answer is, just like the introduction of broadcast television, it took a while for cable news to really change the media environment. When CNN was first established, which would have been circa 1980. It was derided as CNN stood for the Chicken Noodle Network. That there's simply no way that Ted Turner can fill 24 hours of content, news content on a cable channel 7 days a week. It's simply not going to happen. And of course, it did happen, but it took a while for it to take hold. Some of that had to do with the fact that cable access took a while to take hold. And we see this with every new technology as well. But as it did, it began to change the media landscape. I think it would be fair to say that by the 1990s, Bill Clinton was really the first candidate to effectively expand his television strategy to include cable. The difference between cable and broadcast is cable involves what we call narrowcasting, whereas broadcast is broadcasting. It's a large audience of a more generic message, whereas cable requires a more targeted message. So as we start to see more than just cable news, but cable channels develop that are targeted to specific voter groups, it becomes possible then for candidates and in-office presidents as well to channel their messaging specifically through cable. It isn't really until the 21st century that we see the advent of cable begin to contribute to this kind of news diaspora where people start to hide in their own news bubbles. But I'll talk a little bit about that later.
Great, and then this is a two-part question, but I'll ask the first part, and then we'll come back to the second part, because I think it's kind of an interesting one, because as you talk about media, two things that you didn't mention that are neat ideas. The first one that we'll address is, did the movie theater ever play a political role?
Oh yeah, absolutely, newsreels. And it's interesting you mention that too, because people would get news from radio, and they would also go to the movies and they would see newsreels, and that was a way of communicating to people as well. Sort of an interesting side note to this, when in his first administration, when FDR would give a fireside chat, sometimes the theaters would close because they knew people weren't going to go to the theater. They were going to be home listening to the radio. So in that respect, he was competing with the message that people would get in the theaters. But newsreels certainly were a piece of the way people got information, and savvy politicians understood that, and they were able to work within that context as well. Sure.
And I guess I'll ask a related question. I'm just curious. There's newsreels, but there's a long tradition in American cinema of movies about politics, whether it's The Last Hurrah, All the King's Men. I mean, we could name innumerable ones. And I just lost my train of thought. I apologize.
Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yeah, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, this sort of stuff. I mean, and I remember the question now. Did any of those sorts of movies have a strong effect on electoral politics? And the analogy I think of is, how did nuclear power become a public policy issue? You have 3 Mile Island meltdown and the release of the China Syndrome, a movie about a nuclear meltdown within 2 weeks of each other. And it just blows the lid off it in terms of a public discussion. Have any movies done that?
Well, of course, if you were going to time a movie release date and you knew the meltdown was coming, I mean, that you can't plan that, right?
No, I understandably, and that's a given. But
So, yes, so yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of specific events, it's unusual for a movie to reinforce an event in real time like that.
Yeah.
But what the cinema does is reinforce some of the enduring values that people have and that they bring to politics, and that political figures will play to. So if and a lot of this depends, we've seen over time, like I'll use as an example, All the President's Men treats journalists as heroes. Mm-hmm. And the idea of journalists as heroic figures does have a place in our national collective dialogue, but that tends to wax and wane. We're living at a time now where there's a lot of skepticism about journalists, so that movie would play a little bit differently today. So in terms of the values that people take to politics and have about politics, the way Hollywood presents those values, I think, has a lot to do with both reflecting the moment and also reinforcing the moment.
Mm-hmm. Right, and then the second part of the question the teachers asked is, or this particular teacher asked, and I think it's a neat one too, is what about the rise of the use of the telephone?
Oh, that's really interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, it's one we didn't talk about, but clearly.
Well, of course, sure. I mean, I didn't include the telephone in my discussion because the telephone isn't really a mass medium. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, it allows for individual communication over distance, which is revolutionary in its own right. But in terms of the media that have had an effect on our politics, we tend to look at the mass media. Now, the Jackson example is an exception because that was really kind of a local phenomenon, but it was coordinated nationally. And then everything else we talked about, whether it's the telegraph or the radio or television or the internet or social media, all of those are mass media. And it tends to be when there's that mass effect that we see an effect on our politics.
Okay, and then a completely different direction now, a question from a different teacher. There were several televised debates between Nixon and JFK in 1960. How did Nixon do in the debates after that famous first one?
The first one is the one everybody remembers, and there were a lot of issues with Nixon. I mean, there were a lot of issues with Nixon. One of them was that he wasn't feeling well. Another one is that he didn't take the advice of his media advisors. Things that, if you want to get into the weeds of what he did, he wore a white shirt, which on black and white television makes you look harsh and severe. You want to wear a blue shirt. You want to wear a blue shirt also on Zoom. But it affected subliminally the way people responded to him. He looked around, so he appeared shifty. He was sweating. Some of that was because he was not well. But during that sequence of debates, he didn't listen to his media advisors. And some of the things that he could have done that might have mitigated the negative effects of his presentation weren't done. I think the other interesting thing to say about Nixon is he never debated again. There were no debates in 1968. There were no debates in 1972. And people who think, well, presidential debates, it's a tradition. Well, no, it isn't really. I mean, there is the Kennedy-Nixon debate. We tend to think of the Lincoln-Douglas debates as presidential debates. They were not. They were Senate debates. And then you have to go to Ford and Carter in 1976 before you get to the next set of presidential debates. And the reason those took place is because each candidate felt it was in his self-interest to participate, right? Nixon was never going to debate again. He just knew no matter what, he was running this hermetically sealed campaign in 68. There's no way he debates Humphrey. In 1972, he didn't need to debate because he was running away with the election. But in 1976, Carter started out very far ahead. He rapidly lost that lead. So it was in his interest to appear on the stage. Presidents don't like to appear on the stage with their opponents because it elevates their opponents to a presidential status. But because we had debates in 76, and then there was a debate in 1980, then in 84, Reagan, who was going to win the election anyway, decided that he would be willing to debate Mondale, and since then it's become an expectation. But it's certainly not something that has a deep history.
Okay, and there are all the questions I have for the moment, unless someone wants to submit one. So, I don't know whether you want to go into your next segment, Matt.
I'm happy to.
Okay.
Okay, and we can do more questions in a few minutes. Okay, so in this next segment, I'm going to talk a little bit about the rise of internet politics and what makes internet politics a little bit different. So from the telegraph to radio to television, technological advances yielded an increasingly centralized and broad-reaching mass media environment. But the internet is different. The internet is the first mass technology that reverses the centralizing trend, because the architecture of the internet is decentralized. We know that, right? It's a bottom-up medium. It's a medium that operates on a platform that allows you to come to it, right? You can do a search for what you're interested in looking at, and then the search engine gives you options, and you go to it. So in many regards, in many ways, the internet is the anti-television. Television is the centralizing medium, and prior to cable television, again, I thought that was a very good question that whoever asked that earlier about the rise of cable television. Prior to the rise of cable television, we had a centralized media environment because there were 3 networks and they had 100% reach. And so when an event happened, you would turn on CBS and you would watch Walter Cronkite, or you would turn on NBC and watch Huntley and Brinkley. And that was your source of information. The internet turned that on its head. The internet made information decentralized, and it gives ordinary people the means to engage in politics that they would not have, that we would not have, and did not have in the television era. It gives individuals the opportunity to self-organize. It gives individuals the opportunity to fund candidates, to fund causes, to fund movements. And it also, through the early internet, through the advent of blogs, gave individuals the opportunity to have a voice in the news. And we saw during the early years of the internet, individuals who otherwise would not have influence over the national agenda becoming gatekeepers in their own right, and becoming influencers in their own right, because the internet gives them this opportunity. It's the inverse of television. So as we go from the era of broadcast television to the era of cable television, which begins to really arrive in full in the 1990s, and then on the heels of that, immediately the era of the internet, we see the country moving from a centralized modality to a decentralized modality, and that changed not only the locus of politics, but also the practice of politics. It changed the way people go about doing politics. Now, of course, just like every other technological advance, it took a long time for political figures to catch on and to figure this out. Because at first, well, what do you do with this thing? It's sort of like a television with a keyboard, and it was widely regarded as such, right? You get an image, that's nice. Rudimentary websites didn't really allow you to do very much. So what do you do with this thing? It was, for a lot of people, kind of a curiosity, kind of a novelty. You had, by the 1990s, some candidates had websites. Bill Clinton, Bob Dole had websites in 1996. but they didn't really do very much, and nobody quite really knew what they were going to do. Interestingly enough, some of the first individuals who figured out how to harness the decentralized power of the internet were not political figures, but activists. And as it turns out, it was activists of the left who were able to not really figure it out better than activists of the right, but because of their circumstance, they were able to advance their internet presence more effectively. And the reason is conservatives had in the 1990s and in the early 2000s a very efficient, very effective media infrastructure, which encompassed television, which encompassed radio and talk radio. It was very well integrated, well funded, very efficient, and very effective. So into this ecosystem, you now have the early shoots, the early sprouts of the internet. And we started to see on the internet the emergence of what back then was called the blogosphere. And the blogosphere was divided organically into a right blogosphere and a left blogosphere. Some people even called it back then the rightosphere and the leftosphere. So these happened organically, and it makes sense because people come to the internet. They identify with and find other people who are like-minded. So conservatives found other conservative voices, liberals found other liberal voices. There was, in the early days of the internet, actually, if you looked at the size of these two infrastructures, the right had a larger presence on the internet than the left. But because the right also had a pre-existing media infrastructure, over a period of time, some of the voices that emerged on the right became incorporated into this pre-existing infrastructure. And that had the effect of preventing them from becoming unique voices in their own right. So where the internet turned out to be very efficient was through the natural organic emergence of individual voices, people who would develop a following. There was easy entry early on, easy access, and some people would get a following, some people would not. Many of the early blog sites, many of the early weblogs that developed didn't last very long. They disappeared for lack of interest. But a few of them became very effective and found a following. And those websites were able to thrive. What we saw happening on the left, because the left didn't really have the kind of media infrastructure that we saw on the right, those voices were allowed to thrive, and they were allowed to emerge, and they were allowed to develop, which means they developed on the internet in a bottom-up fashion. And it was these activists who first unlocked the key to the internet, which is that the internet is really a bottom-up medium, that people come to the internet. Politics is always regarded as a top-down venture, and for many reasons it has to be a top-down venture. But what the internet provides is a medium that allows for people to find it. I call it the field of dreams phenomenon. If you build it, they will come. And they won't always. That's why a lot of websites went out of business. But the way the internet works is by drawing people together in groups, and those voices then can be magnified on the internet. And if those voices are gathered in a common political cause, they can advance that cause. And in fact, some of the infrastructure that we see on the left, which is now 20 years on, much more effective and much larger and much more integrated than it was at the dawn of the internet age. Some of the organizations that developed early on are still around. The Daily Kos, which is one of the largest political websites in the world, functions now as a kind of news and information and activism clearinghouse for progressive causes. Or the organization Move On, which developed out of the Clinton impeachment. It was actually the name itself, Move On, it relates to the Clinton impeachment. The organizers felt that Clinton should be censured for what he did, but he shouldn't be impeached for what he did. So it was basically censure and move on. Obviously, they're still a very, very big player in the progressive space. So some of these actors developed, some of them didn't, but they understood first, before political figures, that the way you utilize the internet is by taking advantage of this decentralized architecture. I mentioned in the first segment that there are parallels to Andrew Jackson and to the way Andrew Jackson faced the problem of putting together a mass-based political movement from the outside when politics really took place on the inside, and he wasn't an insider. It's the same issue that progressives faced. They felt at the turn of the century that there was no place for them, that there was really no organized liberal or progressive political space, that the Democratic Party would not listen to them if they didn't organize and they didn't have a presence, so they weren't organized. And it was very similar to the issue that Jackson faced. And in a way, the solution is similar, because the decentralized hub and spoke architecture of the internet is like a high-tech version of the kind of hub and spoke system that Jackson put in place 180 years earlier to be able to coordinate his campaign and leverage the interest and the buy-in of grassroots supporters across the country. So they realized it before political figures realized it. But there's also another factor here, and that is that politics, especially campaign politics, has to be orchestrated in some respect. The first presidential candidate to really live on the internet was Howard Dean in 2004. And he lived on the internet. I think he ultimately died on network television, because I think his persona on network television didn't work very effectively. And this is also another really instructive difference between internet politics and television politics that we should keep in mind, how different these two media are. On the internet, Howard Dean communicated passion. On television, he communicated anger, but he was the same person. And the difference is television is a cool medium. We let it wash over us. So somebody who speaks on television in a kind of active way can come across as being hot. It can come across as being aggressive or angry or even overly aggressive. On the internet, have you ever asked people to stop typing in all caps because they're yelling at you? That's how it feels, right? Because you're at the keyboard, you're typing, you're active, you're engaged. And in that kind of an environment, Dean came across as passionate, and his supporters flocked to him. But to get back to this point about campaign coordination, Dean did not have a campaign infrastructure to speak of. He didn't run for president expecting to be the nominee. And then he caught fire, and he had to continue to catch up. So he needed to build the infrastructure that he didn't have, and he was never able to quite catch up to it. So in the absence of any kind of top-down coordination, his internet supporters took over. And because the internet is a bottom-up architecture, what happened was anybody who wanted to could plan a campaign event. Anybody could speak for the candidate, and anybody and everybody did. That wasn't always the best thing, because the campaign then had to explain away its supporters. And you never want to be on the defensive and explain things in a campaign. But that's what happened to the Dean campaign. 4 years later, some veterans of the Dean campaign, with time and with distance, were able to work with Barack Obama to put together the first genuinely effective online internet-based campaign apparatus. And what the Obama people were able to do with money, with time, with distance, and with a candidate who had a personality for both television and the internet. He has what I call a hot, cool personality. He plays in both media. It's very rare that he's able to play in both media, generate passion and excitement among his supporters online, but not frighten people away on television, because he comes across as a kind of cool and collected figure on television. So they had all that to work with. They had time to put it together. And what they did was they put together a campaign infrastructure that allowed the campaign to coordinate what it needed to at the top, but decentralize a lot of the grassroots activity, so that when people came to the Obama website, they were asked, what do you want to do? Do you want to share a testimonial? Do you want to organize an event in your neighborhood? Do you want to give money? What do you want to do? And if you wanted to do any organizing work, you were channeled through a group of steps that organized what you did. So there was coordination, but it didn't undermine the bottom-up architecture of the internet, which is why the Obama online organization was so effective. Obama was the first candidate to be able to figure out how to unlock the political potential of the internet. And in that way, he takes his place alongside Nixon in television, alongside FDR in radio, Lincoln in the telegraph, and Jackson and inexpensive printing technology. He was the first one who was able to figure out how to harness the bottom-up architecture of the internet without allowing it to undermine his campaign. Now, did he then usher in a new political era? Well, the evidence would have to be no, he did not. But does he fit a similar space to Richard Nixon in television, where Nixon also did not usher in a new political era, but he anticipated a new political era that was eventually ushered in several years later by Ronald Reagan? Is that what we're looking at? Well, I don't think the answer to that question is all that clear. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the third and final segment. But let me pause now and take more questions.
Okay, let's see here. So if anybody has questions, go ahead. Please feel free to submit, and I will get them on to Matt. Here you go. We are, let me see here. We've talked a lot about the mechanisms of campaigns. How were they then incorporated into governance?
It's a great question. So let's use Obama as an example of that. The answer to your question is not very well. And at least as far as the internet is concerned, I think with television, very, very well. So let's start with the internet, because one of the things that Obama did after he was elected was he turned his campaign web apparatus, which was called Obama for America, OFA, into something called Organizing for America, also OFA. And he wanted to use OFA as a vehicle for maintaining the kind of grassroots support he had in the campaign and apply it to his governing agenda. But it didn't work very well because governance is completely different from campaigning, right? Governance doesn't have a clear set outcome. Campaigning does. There's going to be an election. You know when it's going to be. You know when election day is. The outcome is going to be clear. You're either going to, your candidate's going to win or your candidate's going to lose. But governing, as we know, is messy. It involves a lot of different parties. It involves trading off. It involves negotiating with Congress. Maybe legislation is going to come about in some form that maybe it's not, maybe nothing's going to happen. Maybe you're going to get something that doesn't look like what you're hoping to put together. There are just a lot of unknowns. And the dilemma that Obama faced with Organizing for America is that he wanted people to continue to come to the campaign and, or sorry, in this case, come to the administration and offer their support, offer their testimonials, offer their help, create a kind of groundswell for his signature initiative, which was the Affordable Care Act, as it was being developed. The problem was there was no Affordable Care Act yet, and nobody knew if it was going to happen, and nobody knew what it would look like. And there were plenty of people, especially among progressives, who wanted it to be a more liberal program than it turned out to be. So when Obama plays the inside game, he looks at the various stakeholders, and the first thing he does is he says, something, we probably can't get a public option. It's probably not going to happen. So I can't promise that. But what do his supporters want? The number one thing they wanted was a public option. And he kind of strings them along. He says, well, we're doing the best we can. But it was pretty clear if you were watching the inside game that it wasn't going to happen. That's not a great way to keep people engaged. And remember, people have to come to it. They have to come to the enterprise. Also, people are not as engaged in policy as they are in politics. It's harder to follow. It's much more unpleasant to follow. I think, frankly, it's just the process is unpleasant to a lot of people. So given the architecture of the internet, it did not work very well. Very quickly, a contrast to television, where it did work very well. Ronald Reagan utilized television better than any American president during that long period of television's dominance. His people in the morning decided what they wanted the soundbite to be, leading off the evening news show. That's where they started. And they worked backwards from there. They knew how to plan it. They knew how to position the president so that they would get the visuals they wanted. They understood if you got those visuals, television producers would have to use them because they understood how television worked. And there was more to it than that. There was a lot of messaging control that went along with that. And what they found was it worked very effectively because television is a medium that works very effectively in governance, whereas the internet is actually a medium that works more effectively for movements. So movement progressives have had tremendous success using the internet in a way that President Obama did not.
And then I'm assuming this is in reference to the President Obama's campaign efforts. Was there use of political parties buying subscriptions lists to target voters at the local level?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question, please?
Sure. Was there use of political parties buying subscription lists to target voters at the local level?
In the Obama campaign?
I believe so. That part is the part I'm kind of inferring. It's not clear in the question.
Yeah, you mean the email lists?
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
Yeah, no question about it. Email lists were and still are gold. I mean, that's if you and so one of the things like if you look at whenever you receive an email asking for a donation, the campaign is collecting the money, but they're also collecting your email information, and they know that you supported them once, which means that you're more likely to support them again. And if you put this list together, campaigns know where their voters are. They begin to understand where their voters are. They can target those voters. They can target them with messaging. They can target them for mobilization when it comes time to vote. So that information, the internet is all about information, and information is really the currency on the internet. So absolutely, yes.
Okay. You mentioned that Move On was a progressive internet movement from the 1990s. Were there any conservative movements that had their inception on the internet as well?
The conservative movements, there was a movement conservatism that predated the internet era, which is why there was really very little need for movement conservatives to reinvent or create institutions. And if you think about the history of the conservative movement, going back to William F. Buckley and then beyond into the 1960s, you saw the emergence of a conservative infrastructure that was incredibly robust and very successful. I would really pinpoint it at around 1980, certainly with the start of the Reagan era and continuing forward after Ronald Reagan. So the infrastructure on the right was there. The infrastructure on the left was not there, was non-existent. Remember, if you go back to let's say the late 90s, we can put it at the late 1990s. So, so Clinton had won the presidency in 92 and 96, never reaching 50% of the vote in the three-way race. And if you look at prior to that, if you look at election outcomes, you can understand how much the left had been struggling. Because going back to 1968, right, Nixon wins in 68, he wins in 72 in a blowout. Then you get the Watergate anomaly in 76, followed by a repudiation in 1980, which is Reagan's first election. Then you have the Reagan blowout in 84. You have the George H.W. Bush blowout in 88. So this is a very long period of time where Democrats are locked out of national office, and the infrastructure that had supported the New Deal coalition had aged, and we're talking about unions, for instance. Unions were on the decline. So that infrastructure wasn't available to the left. It was just a completely different situation.
Okay. Excuse me. Has the influence of the internet on campaign politics surpassed that of television in the current context?
So
Or does one play a more significant role than the other?
that's a really good question, and a difficult question to answer yes or no, because they are both influential. So on the one hand, you see, you see what we've seen over the last, I don't know, it's spotted for the last 12 years or so, the emergence of a kind of cable news bubble, which is supported in some cases by talk radio on the right. It's supported by the internet on the left. It's supported by social media on both sides. So that you're really in a world now where the various media interact. And I think it's very hard to say that one is more influential than the other.
Okay. So that is the last question I have there. If you want to kick back to your.
Okay, so I'll try to keep this segment a little bit shorter if I can, in order to allow time for questions without running over our 2:30 stop time. So I wanted to speak in this segment about the influence of social media, now moving beyond the internet to an era when people are on Twitter, people are on various social media platforms that operate differently from the internet. So what social media allows you to do that the internet doesn't is engage in a back and forth with anybody, from the President of the United States to somebody you don't know, or your neighbor, or your friend, or your relative, and to be able to engage in a back and forth in very short bites about anything you want, and to do it anonymously. And the anonymous part is really important because we can hide behind our screens. And when people hide behind their screens, they can be more aggressive, they can be more out there, they can and often will say things that they wouldn't say to your face. So we're kind of hiding behind our screens, talking to each other, arguing with each other, shouting at each other, not listening to each other. And this is happening along with the emergence of these information bubbles that I was talking about before. So that's the political environment we live in today. At the end of the last segment, I raised the question about Obama. And I said, okay, Barack Obama unlocked the political capability of the internet in a way that no presidential candidate had done before him. But he didn't appear to usher in a new era of politics. Clearly, his presidency was followed by the presidency of Donald Trump. So is it possible that in the long term, he will have done what Richard Nixon did with television and show other people the way to using the internet as an effective medium, which could then be used as the basis for the next era of American politics? And I said that I was going to be equivocal here, and I am. I don't know. But I can make the argument both ways, yes and no. One thing we can do is we could say that if you look at what Obama did with the internet, we're already seeing the ramifications of that moving forward. Small dollar fundraising is now a very big deal. In fact, it's such a big deal that it's kind of hard to imagine that there was a time when it wasn't a big deal. But actually, when Howard Dean was able to do it, when Obama was able to do it, we had never seen anything like it before. And now it's happening at virtually every level, from local campaigns to federal legislative campaigns, House and Senate, to the presidential campaigns. People will give small dollar contributions. The campaigns will collect their information. That information goes on their lists. All of this is now routine. So in that regard, what Obama pioneered is now routine. But there's another thing to think about And I think it's going to play into how effectively the internet functions as the basis for our primary medium of political communication going forward. And that is, if you look at the people who've succeeded on the internet, they tend to be people who are more or less movement politicians, or politicians who are offering to lead a movement. Barack Obama offered to lead a movement. Howard Dean, I think didn't intend to, but he became the recipient of people, his followers came to him as a movement figure, somebody who was saying things that his followers wished someone would say, and they flocked to him. To a lesser degree, but noteworthy, John McCain, when he was running in 2000, was somebody who you could say had a small group of supporters who found him on the internet and came to him during the primaries. Ron Paul, again, a more focused, maybe by more focused figure, I mean somebody with a narrow political base, but a very enthusiastic political base. The point is, intensity matters because of the architecture of the internet. Supporters have to find the candidate. So the candidate has to offer something that's going to be interesting to the supporters, and not every candidate can do that. So you have to be a good fit to the medium to use it effectively, and not everyone is a good fit to the medium. The other issue is that the internet, while it has matured tremendously, and I won't have time to go into the ways it's matured, but internet politics in many respects is much more routinized. It's much, much further along and better developed than it was 10, certainly 15 years ago. At the same time, it's competing with a social media environment that operates on a different set of principles and is just as effective. So if you look at social media, and I apologize, that is my dog, who does not use social media, but thank you, sorry about that. We knew it was bound to happen, right? Just, this is what happens when you're home. So, so social media is, it operates on a different principle. It allows the kind of angry reaction to take place that kind of perpetuates outrage, it perpetuates anger, it perpetuates the kind of very deep feelings that people have, which are big motivators in politics. What it does not do is perpetuate reason or reasoning. And that can be difficult, because not that internet politics traditionally is a mode for reasoned discourse, but it is a long form modality, which is to say, if you're posting in a discussion thread, you're posting more than a few words. You're generally engaging people in a more thoughtful way. You don't have to, but the architecture makes it possible. And Twitter just doesn't do that. Plus, what we're seeing is the left continues to thrive on the internet in a traditional way, and the right is thriving on Twitter. It is impossible for me to imagine Donald Trump becoming president without Twitter. And it's probably impossible for Donald Trump to imagine it, or to imagine being the president without Twitter, because Donald Trump has a connection to his supporters on Twitter. It is a very strong, intense connection, and it is an enduring connection, and it's the way he messages, it's the way he functions. So this is a completely different kind of modality. It's bottom up in the sense that you as a user decide who you're going to follow, but it's top down more than the internet traditionally, in the sense that you follow the words of the individual. You can repost them. Now you can argue about them in comment threads. You can retweet. You can, all of that is possible. But there is more of a centralized messaging component to social media, or at least it makes that available. So what are we looking at as we look forward and we try to envision the future? Well, there are implications for social media, and the implications are profound, because social media intensifies the personalization of politics. We've seen, if you go back to FDR on radio, FDR began this long process of personalizing the presidency, right? He was the first one who spoke to his constituents as my friends. And then television, which creates a sense of false intimacy. And then the internet. Now we have social media, and it's intimate in a way that a lot of other communication is not, and it's immediate. So you put those two factors together, it's instantaneous, it's intimate rather, and it tends to intensify the personalization of politics, so that presidents now are more personalized figures. Presidential performance in the Trump era, I think, stems more from the personality of the president than from the functions of the office. So we have that. And the other thing that's challenging in the social media environment is that it scrambles an information environment that's already challenged by cable programming, and it makes it really difficult to separate truth from fiction. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the late senator from New York, used to say, is attributed as having said, that you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. In the social media world, apparently, you're also entitled to your own facts. And it's very difficult to know what's real and what isn't. And some things that look real aren't real. Some of them come from trolls. Some of them come from troll farms. Some of them come from automated bots. So you could be reading things that look like they're statements of somebody who's a real person, and they are not somebody who's a real person. Instead, they're part of an organized effort to try to influence what you think. It becomes very difficult in the social media environment to know what to think and to be able to think carefully and objectively about things, because the medium doesn't really lend itself to either of those. So where are we going? Well, you can look at the internet and social media as being two different models for the future. I don't know that they're mutually exclusive. I think it's quite possible that we will end up with some combination of both. But what we do know is that the left continues to thrive on the internet and continues to do organization building, fundraising, messaging, and the like, even as the internet continues to revolutionize in terms of its structure and look really nothing like it did 2 decades ago. The question is, will this new technology provide a platform for the next political era on its own, or is it going to have to compete with or share space with social media? And I think it's very likely that it's going to have to share that space. The question is, what influence will it have in its own right, particularly as we still see the internet is a medium that is more effectively used on the left. In turn, we look at social media and we see in the present day that the right thrives on social media. The media ecosystem, the conservative media ecosystem that I addressed in the first segment, is still alive and functioning. It's still quite effective. And so now you have, in addition to internet politics, you have social media politics now incorporated into that larger ecosystem. But I would also raise a note of caution here. Donald Trump uses Twitter arguably more effectively than any other political figure in the country. I would say in history, but Twitter doesn't have a very long history. The question I ask is forward-looking. What happens next? What happens when the day comes and when Donald Trump is no longer on the scene? Can anybody else use Twitter the same way? If social media is really about developing a kind of loyalty to people and a kind of loyalty to individuals and to their personalities, to their brand, if you will, is anybody else out there, especially on the right, who can build that kind of brand, who can command that kind of loyalty? Is anybody else so unconventional as to be willing to tweet things in office that probably no other president ever would think to tweet? Would they be more restrained? Would they feel that they needed to be more restrained? And you know, the more restrained you are, the less effective the medium, because the medium thrives on that lack of restraint. It thrives on emotion. It thrives on anger. It thrives on impulse. Can anybody else fill that space? Can anybody else do that the way Donald Trump does? I'm skeptical, but I'm not so skeptical as to say that Twitter will not be a factor. So as we look forward and try to envision the next political era and the way the media may interact with whoever shapes that era, I think we need to take into account the possibility that both the internet in its more traditional form and social media and the evolution of the both will in fact be parties to what comes next. I know that can be a kind of unsatisfying answer, but I do think and I hope that it offers everybody a place to look as the future unfolds. Certainly we're about to go through an election that's taking place during a period of tremendous upheaval. And one of the things I'm looking at is the role of social media and the internet in that election and then in what comes after it. So I would just be aware of the fact that the future is not clear, that both of these media of communication, I think, will play a role, that they play different roles, that they tend to have been used and are used differently by the right and the left and to different effect, and to see how things unfold. And on that note, I think we still have 10 more minutes for the next set of questions.
Okay. Well, of course, someone just submitted another one and it jumped on me. Give me 1 second. You talk a little bit about this already, Matt, and in fact, about 2 weeks from now, we'll have a graduate program here at the Foundation on the War on Terror that actually is going to engage some of this as well from the intelligence end. And that is, what about the challenge of social media and foreign interference on elections? Mm-hmm. I don't know whether you can speak to that a little bit or we actually are having a number of people engage that a couple weeks down the line with a different cohort of teachers.
I would love to hear what they say. I think it's an extraordinarily important thing to address. It's yes, it's a factor. We know it's a factor. Our intelligence agencies have told us as much. And from a user end, it's insidious because you can't tell as a user whether you are hearing from or responding to someone who's typing to you from a Russian troll farm or who is a bot. There are ways of finding out. You can actually, if you were inclined to look at particular individual or entities' history, there are ways of determining how likely it is that you're dealing with a bot, but people aren't going to do that. They're going to respond because Twitter, again, it's an emotional medium. People just react. And it can, in fact, shape our attitudes, and that in turn can shape our behaviors. It can be used to divide people because Twitter is a very good medium for division, if you want to use it that way. So it's an incredibly important point.
Okay, good, and that kind of segues nicely into this next question, and that is, should the internet be regulated like television, and how might that enhance or confound politics?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a difficult question to answer because you do get into issues of free speech. First of all, I would say that even television is not regulated the way television used to be regulated. So that changed in part to be able to accommodate narrowcasting with the advent of cable, with the Communications Act of 1996. But television, when we think of television in the day of the three major networks, there was an equal time provision, there was a fairness doctrine, there were things that you could and could not do if you wanted to maintain your license. My favorite story about that is in 1980, if an affiliate television station was going to play an old Ronald Reagan movie, the FCC said you had to give equal time to Jimmy Carter. So if you wanted to play Bedtime for Bonzo, you had to give Carter 90 minutes. That kind of regulation is long gone, and isn't really applicable to cable the same way, and it isn't applicable to the internet. So do I think there needs to be discussion of regulation? I do. I think that this is, if we look at the internet as a public resource, then I think it's appropriate to think about regulation. But I think you have to be very careful when you're thinking about regulation to take into account free expression. And it's a very, very tough issue. And that's about the edges of, we're at the edges of what I know. So I'm reluctant to say any more. I think for that, you'd probably need somebody who's versed in the law.
And then this is, I think it's a great question. To what extent does social media create further hyperpolarization in our politics, or is social media just showcasing what has long existed?
Yes, yes to both. It is. It's certainly not responsible for the polarization. The polarization arguably predates. Maybe it doesn't predate Twitter, but it certainly predates Twitter as a mainstream resource. It certainly contributes to it. Because we see the way people use social media, and as I said a few minutes ago, it can be used to divide, and it can be used to make people less likely to want to listen to each other, and because social media also contributes to these pre-existing echo chambers where people can now self-select the information that they want to absorb. There's a phenomenon that's long been known to political communication researchers, which is called selective exposure, where people will consciously seek out ideas that are aligned with what they already believe. And the media environment of today, which is cable television and the internet and social media, simply gives you so many options to do that. And then if you think about the way so many of these media are linked to each other, so you find a link on Twitter that takes you to a cable news account of something, or that takes you to a website that's ideologically affiliated with the Twitter site that you started from. It's not only easy to remain within your sphere, I think it's actually hard to break out of it.
Yeah. No, and as you were speaking, I was thinking of my background as a political scientist is really urban politics and protest, and I've studied protest under a National Science Foundation grant on the wall in Washington, D.C., and this kind of stuff. And to me, I've been fascinated with, and I'm not going to pretend I know the answer, is now how this social media has reconnected with street protest on both sides of the aisle. I mean, both, whether you're Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. But I don't know whether you have any thoughts about that as well, or.
Well, I don't have any data. I haven't studied it. So anything I would say would be anecdotal and based on what I've observed. But certainly people talk about their experiences. They organize online, and sometimes that organizing is done informally, where people will post video of a protest that they went to, or they'll post an announcement of a protest they're going to. And they can invite other people to go. So I mean, certainly it's a vehicle for that. Certainly, social media is a vehicle for that. The internet is a vehicle for that. So again, I don't have any data to be able to say definitively yes or no, but it certainly speaks to the way the media operate.
All right, and that kind of, again, is a great segue for the next question. Has social media helped the general public become more involved in politics, or is the involvement only superficial due to the use of memes, tweets, Facebook posts, et cetera?
Thank you for that question, especially because this is something that I have experience with, because my research back in the television age was about television and the demobilization of America. And one of the things that actually got me interested in studying internet politics about 15 years ago was I had written so much about the relationship between television and disengagement, television and apathy. And here were people online who were clamoring to get involved. I'd never seen anything like it. And if you went to Blog for America was the name of the official blog of the Howard Dean campaign in 2004. And if you went to Blog for America, you had ordinary people asking the campaign to ask them to give money. And I thought, that doesn't happen. I've never seen anything like that happen. And people would say, they'd ask, when is there going to be an event? What can I do? How can I help? And it's because of the different architecture of the two media, right? You're dealing now with the internet, which is a bottom-up medium. And when people were energized, and people have to bring their own energy to it. They have to bring their own motivation to it. But if they have that motivation, the internet gives them a way to channel it and to coordinate with other people who they otherwise wouldn't know are out there who have the same motivation. Yeah. So yes, there is a very big difference in terms of engagement. And I think we see it in things like turnout rates for elections. I think we see it in how much national issues have been elevated in importance. Now, obviously, now we're going through a period of time that I think is exceptional. But even before these last few months, we've seen this for a while. So yes, if apathy and political disengagement were the hallmarks of the television era, certainly the opposite is the case now.
Yeah, no, I just sort of to tag onto that, I mean, for teachers to kind of help illustrate this, I'm heading towards the last year of my term as a school board member.
Congratulations.
I'm really looking forward to it because it's been a heck of a ride with all the complexity. But anyhow, point being that when I ran for office, the party at the county level assumed we were sacrificial lambs that we would never win. And within 2 campaign cycles, we took over the whole board. But one of the reasons we did was, I'd argue, is I had community members, parents who weren't happy with the school board, that it wasn't engaged with students, all this sort of stuff. And they stepped up and said, I work in social media. Let me make a 30-second campaign commercial for you. Let me, advise all you guys of how to get out there and how to push. And we had our own social media people that just were parents that stepped up. And, and it was all organized through Facebook and these other things. So I can tell you, at least at a very local level outside Philadelphia, that's very true what you assert.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And it's a great example too. And I'm also familiar, my own school board, with people who have engaged in social media campaigns. I'm thinking of one in particular was very effective, and one probably wouldn't have won without it. So absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
It's a great example.
So let's see here. Teacher says, this is going back a bit, but can you please explain the genesis of cable news? Why was it created, and what were the reasons for making media consumption more, they use the term partisan, biased, selective? I mean, might be another one.
So the origin of cable news would go back to CNN in the early days of cable. And, the simple answer to that question is the space was available. Ted Turner took a risk and decided that the space could be filled. And, I think that the market decided that it could. If it turned out there really was no market for 24/7 news, as his detractors said, it would have failed, and we wouldn't have seen others emulating it. If we're talking about cable news, obviously, then you'd want to talk about Fox, and you'd want to talk about MSNBC. Fox began as an initiative that was designed to narrowcast to a different segment of the market. So CNN was originally designed to target news junkies, people who were interested in news and who didn't want to have to wait until the evening news came on at 7 o'clock or their newspaper came the next morning. This gave them immediate access to news stories, and it turned out that there was a market for that. Fox News was looking to reach out to conservative viewers who were distrustful of the messages that they were getting in the mainstream media, and who would turn to a place where the messages they heard were more in line with their worldview. And I think it's evolved into much more than that in terms of the way it has largely let down the distinction between editorial content and news content. Although there is still some what you might consider traditional straight news content on Fox, it's much less so. MSNBC began as a partnership between Microsoft and the NBC television network. That's why it's MSNBC. And it's sort of quaint to think about it now, but the idea was you would have the same content on a web page that you had on television, because people didn't do that. And the idea was to see if you could sort of join forces between the two media and expand your audience that way. Only later did it sort of evolve into a vehicle for left of center thought. And the primetime lineup on MSNBC is certainly left of center. During the day, they do a little bit more of the straight news. But again, it was a different niche. They found they were looking for a place where they could find viewers. So each one of them really appeals to a different viewership. And when you narrowcast, you don't need a very wide viewership. You just need a loyal viewership. So as long as you're able to get enough of those people coming back day after day, you're going to do fine.
Okay. With that, thank you. I know you have a hard stop at 2:30 and it is 2:34. So we don't want to hold you, but that was great. Thank you for coming and speaking with the teachers. Teachers, don't go anywhere. I'm letting Matt go because he has this hard stop. I have a couple housekeeping things for you all. But again, Matt, thank you. This was great.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. And thank you to all who were listening in today.
Thank you. All right. For the teachers,